Now, we come back again to the why. The second book I put in is called Cultural Transfer and Romanticism. And one of the thoughts I'd share with you is that having proven, I believe, that these people were not driven from their home by poverty, persecution, but in fact enjoyed an adventurous personality, and we gave them the mechanism whereby they could come, I still came back to the why. Why? Some cultures do not migrate, the French being one. 500,000 in the 19th century left, but 5.5 million Germans. Now, it's quite a big difference. And you think, well, it might be language, but what I came to consider, and I had some, it was a diary of a young man who came from the Berlin area, very well educated, parents I believe to be dead, spoke a number of languages, English, French, Italian, and he quoted Schiller as he left England. He took an English ship because he thought they were better than the German ones, but he quoted Schiller and his play of Jeanne d'Arc, and he said, where will I roam, where will I end up, will I ever see these wonderful shores again? And I read that and I thought, no, what on earth is he on about? And then I started to think about German literature, art, music. It is full of, and they're certainly responsible for, a movement, or part of a movement called Romanticism. It's this idyllic way of looking at the world. It's a sense of other places, of wide open places. You see pictures that are part of the German trope of people standing on mountains, looking out at snow-capped mountains, at the sky. Their leader, the songs. Most of us as kids, when we're at school, we're all similar age, sang a song called The Happy Wanderer. I love to go a-wandering. It's German. You know, these songs have come to us from the German diaspora of music and song and art, and I thought there's part of their psyche that sends them out into this big wide world. Even within Germany, they have forests, they're big on hiking, spending time with nature, spending time in what they call the bush. We don't think it is. They've got pet cows. I mean, not many people in Australia have a pet cow, you know, because they've only got 10 cows in their barn. But nevertheless, there's this notion of, you know, it's a romantic notion of the world. When I see the why, I think there's a strong link between that movement and how German people think. Not all German people, but I think that is certainly a part of the cultural identity of German-thinking people. In terms of transfer, when I looked at, and certainly John Muller and Reinberg is here are good examples, but I used a man called Adolf Wörfel because it was a bit easier for me, and one does these things. But Wörfel came, fabulous stuff on his trip to Australia, landed at Melbourne, and he'd read Anthony Trollope. And so of course he's quoting Trollope when he arrived in Melbourne, and he uses Trollope's work in Sydney. And what does he do? He goes off gold mining. And he only does that for 2 weeks. It was the most ghastly experience he ever had. He walked for 2 or 3 weeks, he got hot and bothered, he didn't get any gold, and he came back, and he had what I think is probably equally ghastly experience. He came down to the Riverina area, and of course what was he doing? He was droving sheep, thousands of them. And then he actually had to work with some tank sinkers, whom he described as the most pedestrian bovine people he'd ever met, because it was Good Friday and he was washing clothes on Good Friday. And in his diary he says, who would ever think I would play the washerwoman and on Good Friday? Because as part of his ideology, there are religious feast days. You don't do that sort of thing. And he thought these people were very coarse. Now, when he eventually got his little feet on the ground, he went to Burke, and he worked there as a labourer for a short time until the accountant that ran the business went somewhere else. And he said, look, I have bookkeeping skills. Can I do the job? And the boss said, give it a go. And he was very good. He introduced double entry bookkeeping. And when I started to look at some of the things that Wörfel brought, he eventually came to Dubbo and was on the town or Shire Clerk in Dubbo. He set up, and he came out in 1874, and I think it was in Dubbo about 1896. But I look at the contribution he made, and because he was a litigious and probably a very active person, you find him on the board of the local hospital. He has tours of his property where he's growing fruit, and he exports fruit. He's very big in looking at implementing fruit fly control, and he writes to the paper all the time about this. Henry Parkes comes out, John Reed, these people visit him, and I started to look at the things that Wörfel introduced to his town. He set up a cafe and had Christmas teas and afternoon teas and sold confectionery. And some of these things come from a German background. The fruit growing, I thought, the export, music, he played the flute and something else in the choir at church. When I looked at him as a romantic person, I thought he has seriously contributed to the life in Dubbo. We did a rural seminar in Dubbo some time ago, and I was delighted that people came out of the woodwork, one who'd bought his house, and he was not well known because, as many of you would be aware, during the war, First World War, there was anti-German feeling. But some of these people, and I hark back to the Reinbergers, John Reinberger was 15 in 1855, born in 1840. So by 1914, he's 74 years of age. He's come here as a 15-year-old. Some of these other people from Nassau, the Mullers in Nowra, one as a 5-year-old was listed as an enemy alien. He's 5 when he came here, and of course, same, he's 50 years of age, and he suddenly in turn is an enemy alien. And I think it broke the hearts of some of these. In Werfel's case, he changed his name and he died, but his family took the name of the wife, which was Dalgleish. So you don't see Werfel, and this of course makes any sort of tracing of history quite difficult. I come back to context, because what I've tried to show you is a context, particularly for the migration from the Duchy of Nassau, and say that if I had just looked at the letters in isolation, then the whole notion of indenture may not have appeared. Now, this is the whole of the Duchy of Nassau, and you can see these are the migrants according to a book called A Man Called Strook. And what he did was to collect up the ads that the Mail had to put in the local paper in 1854 to advertise that they were leaving. And each one would say, let's say John Reinberger, 1854, October, probably did it in September, I'm advising that I am leaving town, blah, blah, blah. And he collected them up and they had to say where they were from. And you can see that Kirchner had very heavily taken people from the Rhine. This list is not exclusive. We pretend it is, but Strook of course missed people. You know, people left who didn't advertise, they just snuck off and didn't tell anyone, so they don't appear. Strook had, I think, about 1,200 on his list, and we know there are about 6,000. But nevertheless, the reason for putting it up, these are what are called amps or districts, and it's the Duchy of Nassau, and just shows you the boundaries of it. The main thing is that it shows you that this is where most of the ads came from, was the Rhine. This is a list of people. You can't see them that clearly, and I apologise for that, but what you can see is the ship they came on. So that first lot, 1 to 11, are on the Reichstag, and they're sent to a variety of people, MacArthur's and Lindemans being the main ones, and then we get the next lot on the Caesar, and you know, we've got blocks of people all going together, and there are the 2 Reinbergers on the Caesar. I'd add that poor old John Reinberger, the Caesar had cholera, and it had the highest amount of death, 15% death rate, 40 people died of any ship that I know of. It left the convict ships and the slave ships for dead, and it was most unfortunate that they had cholera. The convict ships after a time ended up with a ship surgeon on board, and in fact even some of these Hamburg ones, they set up houses for the migrants to stay in before they left, but that was an absolute disaster. And for John Reinberger, who went to Bega, you know, to lose a wife and youngest child and daughter must have been absolutely overwhelming for him. He never married again, and there's evidence in the Mudgee, Muller and Reinberger diaries that of course they wrote letters to each other, but I think it's very sad. And then you look at the next lot that came on the Cateau Hotel, and then there are a few odd ships that from time to time occur, but people had to apply for these. This is how you triangulate and get little bits of information. This is a letterhead, and it just says Thermal St Moritz, but 2 of the women were writing letters from this place, and this was another little bit of help I got in triangulating. And of course the letters that got on them, St Moritz bad, and this was one of the letterheads. And I went to St Moritz to the archive, and it's only open from 3:30 till 5:30, 2 days a week. And they're very, very kind, and I said, I'm looking for a hotel in St Moritz that was in existence in 1864. And they said, there isn't one. And I said, of course there is. I've got letters from these people that came there. No, there isn't one. And then I showed them the picture. Ah, you mean such and such. And just the names have changed. And suddenly out came the wages books, and here are the women I'm looking for, because of course they're employed here. This is now the Kempinski Hotel, and it's gone through all sorts of changes, but that was the hotel these girls worked in. Now, you can't read this, you don't have to. What it is, unfortunately, is not the English, it's the German version. But this is the indenture form that they signed. And if any of you are doing German migration, our state records, see it says SRNSW, Immigration, CGS 5239, letter received for miscellaneous purposes. This certificate is in box 9/6192. If you go to our state records and ask for 9/6192, that's what you'll get. And you'll get the flip side of it is in English. I'm sorry this is in German, but you know, I give talks in both places, and when I was rattling around trying to find the English one for you, I'm sorry I couldn't find it. But the point I want to make, and as I said, there's the name, it's Conrad Frank in this case, and it tells you who his parents are, and his wife, and where they're born. Her Christian name, Deborah, and such. And then we come down here, and it'll list him and the children, and then we come down to who he's indentured to, and he's got to sign it. Where's he from? Rauenthal. You get quite, and who is it? James Thomas Mitchell, Esquire. So that's where he's been sent to. So that information is available to you if you choose to go to state records. State records have all sorts of things, and the archivist, as Christine will tell you, will help you. And this was just an example. Now that Trove's around, we all love Trove, but you see the spelling of Cato-Wattel. You can't be too fussy about these things because the names change. Names are real, the devil's in the detail, but it was actually from Antwerp. But you'll see in some family history studies or local history, they say it was from Hamburg. Well, no, it wasn't. It was from Antwerp. I think it's the only ship that came from Antwerp. But Kirchner was advertising, and so 15th of the 3rd, I think it came in a week or two before. But he was just advertising that, you know, he's got people, not for sale, but people are available. If the person who sponsored them died, then they had to be moved on to somebody else. And that's often what happened here, died or became insolvent. On that note, I shall end, and I've got a couple of minutes to take questions if anyone has a question. As I said, this book and the other one, they're in the library, so please, you'll find far more information there. Publish your work and triangulate. Yes?
You were talking about Nassau.
Yes?
In the north of Germany, I have where we came from, Bremerhaven.
Yes.
Did the same circumstances for immigration apply to different areas of Germany, or?
What do you mean by same circumstances?
You were talking about the different types of immigration that could be applicable, like poverty or violence.
Oh,
would that apply
to
other areas as well?
I can't say that that's the case. However, when I've looked at data that is available to me, I don't see any evidence for those other factors. I think they're factors we've fallen in love with because they make a good story and they make us feel comfortable. It is much the same now. If you think of what we're saying to refugees at the moment, as long as they're refugees, we're happy they come. As soon as we say they're economic migrants, they say they've got to go somewhere else. Now, I think most of these people were migrants, and there is huge evidence for settler countries, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, America. We've all done really, really well having the basis of our society being migrants. But no one, as soon as you come in, you draw up the drawbridge and you say, you can't come, you're an economic migrant. Yeah, that's exactly what it appears to me we're doing now. As long as they're refugees, they must be worthy. But if they're not refugees, we don't want them. I haven't worked on Bremerhaven. I've been to Bremerhaven. It just means the harbour at Bremen. And there's a big migration museum there, and most of it is just about tracing your relative. It's not necessarily the theory. But I would believe if you actually scratched around, the poor do not migrate. They don't have the means.
I've never looked at it that way. I've always looked for reasons, but not looked at it that way.
Well, when you slightly flip it and think, well,
yeah,
how likely is a person who is in abject poverty, and you'll say to me, what about the Irish situation? And I'd say, well, the Irish had that potato blight, as did the Germans, for 50 years. That last one of 47 to 1849 blew their heads off, and I think in many cases it's true. We paid, we shipped them out, just as they were shipped. There were migration societies and towns that would ship people out to get rid of them.
Yeah.
Now, it may be in those instances, and I think it is with some of the Irish, although I suspect they were better off Irish, who were prepared to take the risk and go to America. The rest died. You know, the ones that were seriously afflicted in Ireland, when you read some of the Irish data, one awful story, they walk for miles from Carvin to the next town because they think there's food, and half of them die on the way there and the other half die on the way back. You know, and I suppose what I'd say is that these horror stories, I don't think they're the ones who I wrote.
So they wouldn't have had anything like the poverty poor laws like in England for immigration. They didn't have that in Germany?
I don't know. I'm certainly aware from the documentation I've read of North America, and this is another problem. North America. When people went, they went from these various ports, Hamburg, Bremerhaven, Le Hague, Antwerp. They've got to get there. So you've got to have money to get there. But when they get there, and it often happened with Hamburg, the harbour would freeze over. So if you're unfortunate enough to get to the harbour in wintertime and your boat couldn't leave, you need the money to stay somewhere, and initially you paid for that yourself. Because there were such disasters, the authorities put in place cheap hotels, for want of a better term, but they were lodging houses for migrants. That's half the story. Get across to New Brunswick in Canada, and we all know Canada's as cold as charity. You get there, if you get there in November and you can't quite get to your boss, well, you're going to stay in New Brunswick, well, who's going to pay for your food? And so money and resources they took with them were dissipated, and some of the writings about New Brunswick are ghastly, saying you've sent us all these impoverished people who are starving to death. Well, I'd suggest they weren't starving to death when they left home. But after a misadventure in Hamburg, more misadventure in the port of origin, they're in a dreadful way. So I think it's important to look at these factors and just make sure that what you think you're saying is actually true, that it's not just part of the story, the aftermath of when they got there. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yes. It's food for thought.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Are your books for sale?
Sort of. If you get hold of me, I'll send you one. I didn't bring any up to I'll take some to annual conference. But I've put a copy of both of them in the library. You know, and you can use them there. My email is in the front of the book, so you can write to me if you want a copy of the book, and I'll post you one.
Thank you. Please join me.